So, good afternoon, Anna McCormack. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Kat. And you?
I am fine. So, I've been interested for a long while to have a series on women of the resistance in Australia and New Zealand because I think there's a number of amazing women who are doing amazing work. And I was looking at some of the photos that you had put up on Facebook of campaigning against abortion for like 40 years. Just amazing, you know.
That's how long it took us.
40 years. That's, God, I hope this new fight with against the trans movement is not going to be 40 years.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think we'd survive that long, actually.
I don't think so.
Do you mind if I show some of those pictures? Because
That's fine.
I think
Yeah,
they're
sure.
amazing. Hold on a sec.
So I should mention that the reason I posted those pics was the other day, it was the third anniversary of us winning abortion decriminalisation in Queensland. So I wanted to mark it by putting up some pics of yesteryear and the struggle around abortion rights in Queensland.
I know. Is it abortion rights across all of Australia now? I assume so.
Yes, yes, finally. Although it's interesting because you can, before you get to actual decriminalisation, many states have court cases where the words for the preservation of the mother's life, which are in the criminal code, that's often the words that give you an out for getting an abortion. Yeah. And so cases have been brought to court for an interpretation of those words. And so in Victoria in 1969, we got the first liberal interpretation of that, which provided for women to be able to get an abortion if their mental health was in jeopardy. And then in 1971, we got an even more liberal finding in New South Wales, where for the preservation of the mother's life was interpreted to take into account not only mental health, but also social and economic factors. And so those court cases actually took place before decriminalisation was won. Similarly, for Queensland, we had a liberal court case finding in 1986, but we didn't actually win decriminalisation until 2018. So, of course, once you get a liberal court case interpretation, the battle is won a little bit, but not fully. It's not fully won until you go the next step, which is the big one, decriminalisation.
Wow. What kept you going all that time? That's 40 years. It was quite poignant because I noticed that you had listed the names of, women who had started up 40 years ago and were no longer here. And some of them hadn't even seen that they'd won at all.
Yeah.
That was really...
When I went and sat in at Parliament House on that night of the 17th of October 2018 to watch the vote, I thought of those women, the Eva Bacons and the Margaret Baxendales and the Liz Pascoes and the Helen Barbans, etc., the women who were very involved way back in the beginning, but who passed before we won. And so, really quite poignant to remember those women who didn't actually live to see the win.
So tell me a bit about yourself. How did you get involved in activism and what got you involved?
Well, I suppose my activism was given a shot in the arm in 1976.
Okay.
I'd already been involved to an extent in opposition to the American war against Vietnam and Australia's involvement in that. That was the first thing that I got involved in. But in 1976, I had an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy. And I was already a little bit involved in the abortion rights movement. But when I had an unwanted pregnancy and realized that I couldn't get a legal, safe abortion in my own state, that I would have to go to New South Wales to do that. And bearing in mind that New South Wales at this stage had not decriminalised abortion, nor had Victoria. They hadn't. But New South Wales and Victoria had both had liberal court findings. So New South Wales in 1971 had the finding that said, you know, you could mount a defence for having an abortion if your psychological health and your economic and social positions were threatened. So it was under that ruling that clinics were operating in New South Wales. But we hadn't had our liberal court case finding yet. That didn't happen for another 10 years. So I had to go to Sydney to get an abortion that I would be, you know, 95% comfortable going to be charged under the law. Yeah. So that really stepped up my activism in that area for me, because it was infuriating. And I spoke to so many other women who were going through the same thing. And then I got involved in a little counselling agency. It was an alternative to a mainstream abortion counselling agency run by Children by Choice. So we were sort of to the left of Children by Choice, and we kept our little agency going for a bit of time. And so that just added to my commitment to be involved in this struggle, because I met these young women who came from far north Queensland and Western Queensland, never been on a plane before, never seen buildings more than 2 stories high before. And suddenly they had to come not only to Brisbane, but then we had to put them on a plane to Sydney to get an abortion. So that then became, you know, a huge issue for me to do something about it.
Wow. You were pretty young at that time.
Yeah, I was 24 in 76 when I had an unwanted, unplanned pregnancy. Not nearly as young as many, you know. I mean, I would counsel 17 and 18-year-olds from Western Queensland who were faced with unwanted pregnancy. So, you know, at least I was 24, but still. That was a real wake-up call for me. It really told me, you need to step up, Anna, and you need to do as much as you can to change this. And of course, our activism had on-off periods. We were quite involved in the late 70s. And then...
was it solely around abortion, or was it also around the... Okay.
No, it was largely around, well, the group that I joined in 76, Women's Abortion Campaign, it was solely around abortion. Okay. And then when we sort of had ebbs and flows, we had a big upsurge of activism in 1989, because that was when we got a Labor government, which was the first time for many years, and they actually had policy saying that they would repeal the abortion laws. Of course, they didn't, but it activated us even more.
Why do you say, of course they didn't? I've got to say, I'm fairly ignorant on all this topic.
Well, they didn't because there was really no political commitment at that time. This is 1989. I mean, Labor Party women had tried very hard over the years to ensure they had progressive policy. But as Wayne Goss pointed out at the time in downplaying our campaign, Wayne Goss was the Labor Premier, and he said, well, yeah, we've got policy that supports a national bank, as a state-owned bank as well, but we're not going to do that. So he was basically saying, oh, sure, we've got policy, but you expect us to be serious about it? Well, we did, and we behaved as if we did. And so we did take to the streets again, and we went and met with politicians. And at that time, a US philanthropic group provided some money to Children by Choice, which was a counselling agency, to employ a political worker for 6 months. And so that was the first time that had happened. And I was that worker. It was a 6-month part-time position, and the brief was, one, to get funding for Children by Choice as a counselling agency. It had been running since the early 70s, just on donations. Mm-hmm. And two, to get decriminalisation of abortion. Well, at that time, we didn't win the second one, this 1989-90, but we did finally get funding for Children by Choice, and they've been funded ever since as a counselling agency.
You know, with the work that you've been doing currently and the work you've done in the past, has there been much in the way of differences in terms of approaches or strategies or tactics? Is it very similar? Or
no, look, in terms of the work that I do, it's similar. I'm an activist. I've always been an activist. That's the contribution I can make, street action, that sort of thing. And I will say the writing was on the wall even back in the late 70s through the 80s, because the group that I was involved with, the Women's Abortion Campaign, we had ideological differences with the women who were involved in Children by Choice, who were largely older than us. I was a lot younger then, and probably better off economically than our little group. And the difference in those days was that they always presented abortion as a woman's right to choose, which of course it is. It's a good slogan, it gets support. But our focus was much more on women's rights. This is not about an individual's right to choose. This is not choice feminism. And so we, even though the trans issue and gender identity ideology, we weren't aware of that at the time, but we had a much more class-based approach to women as a sex class than the sort of more choice feminist orientation, which emphasized very much individual choice rather than class-based rights. So those differences were there then, and I see them reflected now, of course, as we, the radical feminists and gender-critical feminists, fight to defend women's sex-based rights. Because the opposition, which within women's groups comes largely from choice feminists, they've always had this choice approach and this individual empowerment approach, which is why through the 90s, they also saw things like porn and prostitution and surrogacy as individual choices and as ways women could become empowered. So those differences were quite evident then, difference in approach.
Yeah, it's I'm a lousy feminist. Well, I'm not a feminist.
That's all right.
I know nothing about it, but it's confusing to me that it seems like most of the people that we're fighting is actually other women. It's really depressing, but we seem to be predominantly fighting, like in the trans movement, it seems to be mainly the champions and the allies are women. Would you say that's true?
No, I don't. I don't think that's true. I think that that it is the go-to position for liberal feminism to say that, yes, men can become women. It is consistent with an individual approach. And I think that loss of a class-based approach to women happened in the 90s. That's when I think it happened. But I do think it's driven by men.
I definitely think it's driven by men. It's just I find it shocking when a woman supports it. I really don't understand why, how they cannot see that it's so serving men's rights groups and it's men's agenda. Particularly when so much of it is driven by porn. People who are promoting porn.
Yes. I think it takes quite a bit before people see those connections. And when I'm talking about it with friends, I often use the example of my own family. So I have a 40-year-old daughter, a 66-year-old sister, she's a few years younger than me, and a 93-year-old mother. Okay. So 3 very different age groups. Now, all 3 of those women, when I first started to talk to them about gender identity ideology, all 3 of them, 40, 66, 93, said words to the effect of, "Oh, Anna, can't you just be kind? and inclusive. That's the go-to position. It's the go-to conservative position, I find.
What have been some of the major challenges of getting your message out? What are your key things that you want people to take away? What are the key things that you want
in terms of this struggle?
Yes, this current struggle. What do you want people
look,
to know?
I guess one of the key things I think is discover your courage, discover your inner courage, because that is what's holding us back. When you talk to people and when you explain what gender identity ideology does to women's position in society, to women's safety, dignity, privacy, and girls, and lesbians in particular, and boy children, and male homosexuals, when you're able to explain that, most people, I find, agree with you.
Yeah.
But most people will not come with you to a street protest because they're too scared. And for some women who are in particular employment positions, say in particular public service positions or even in the private sector, there's a valid fear of being disciplined at work, even losing your job. And I've spoken to a couple of women about their friends who've lost their jobs for being gender critical. So I don't expect that those women will suddenly take to the streets. However, I know a lot of other women who are in jobs where it will be no skin off their nose to come out as gender critical. I know lots of retired women like myself. They can't take jobs from us. We don't have jobs to lose. I did lose a small social work position for being a TERF, but, you know, and I loved that little job. It was great for a retired person. Yeah. But for many of us, loss of job is not an issue. And I see many women who, like me, have been involved in the left for a long time, so scared of being abused by their left-wing friends. And it is scary. And I was scared of that too when it happened. And those left-wing friends dumped me. They all dumped me, or I dumped them. But you just have to. You have to draw a line in the sand, because most people do know that men can't become women. Mm. So I think courage is a big issue.
Yes, it is. It's always an issue. Okay, but so that's what it takes to get the message out. But what is the message that you want people to get? What is it? See, if you say the two core most important things for people to know about this movement, what would it be?
I think that it is very harmful. It's a toxic ideology that does extensive harm to women and girls, to lesbians in particular. Mm. And I think that we need to be able to explain, and there's good reason why we're not able to explain this in terms of the media blackout, but we need to be able to explain the detail across a whole range of areas: education, health. I mean, we were just talking earlier about education, but also health, a whole range of issues where women and children are damaged so badly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, you know, when people know that stuff, they're totally on board. But our media will not critique it.
Don't you think that it's one of the major reasons is because of the deceit of the marketing message of the trans? So, for example, there was never trans children. Then there aren't trans children. They're just LGBT children, autistic children, or children, young girls who don't want to be boys because of abuse, etc. Those are what they target to transition. There are no trans children.
Yeah.
Those ones. So, you know, you've got these kids who've been transitioned, targeted in schools. You know, they're targeted in schools.
Yeah.
Victoria, when I was doing an article for Moira Deming's site in defenseofchildren.org, I looked at the Victorian policies. And the Victorian policies in the schools, they can bring in people, the gender clinics like the Royal Children's Hospital, where Michelle Telfer is, to advise When do you get someone who sells a product and sells a service to be the advisor? Do you know what I mean? How is that going to be impartial? But they're the ones who advise that these children are are non-conforming, therefore they're in the wrong body. What a horrible situation.
And that issue of conflict of interest goes throughout. One that I'm involved in at the moment is the review of the sex discrimination, of the Anti-Discrimination Act in Queensland. So the review was announced in May, and the initial consultations were 20-minute phone calls for organisations to have with officers from the Queensland Human Rights Commission. Now, the Queensland Human Rights Commission is conducting the review. The Queensland Human Rights Commission is deeply compromised on this. They're ideologically committed to prioritising gender identity over sex. So they should not be conducting the review. And when I had my 20-minute conversation with the staff from QHRC, who of course, most of whom sign off their emails, she, her, that was my first point. Look, you should, with respect, you should not be conducting this review. And we also, IWD Brisbane Meanjin, which is a little group, the tiny little group I'm involved in, we wrote to the minister at the time and the Attorney General, who's also ironically the Minister for Women, and we said a number of things, but the first one was, this group, Queensland Human Rights Commission, is not the body to be conducting this review. Unfortunately, we got nowhere. The other point that we made was that the review of the Anti-Discrimination Act, it has a 10-person reference group. Now, every member of that 10-person reference group represents, or just about every member, represents a group within the population that experiences discrimination. We'd all agree. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience discrimination. People from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds experience discrimination. People with disabilities experience discrimination. The one group that experiences discrimination that's not even represented on the reference group, women.
Yeah.
It's like the die has been cast and it's set, and they don't even recognise sex anymore as anything to do with discrimination and oppression.
That kind of brings up another question, like what are the major frustrations that you have around all this space, trying to get them? I
find the media blackout a huge source of frustration and concern, and in particular, the publicly funded media, the ABC and SBS. The ABC is really just a propaganda of gender identity ideology. They refuse to interview any of our spokespeople, and we have some extraordinary spokespeople on our side from the women who are trying to rebuild the women's liberation movement, but they never have been interviewed by the ABC. And that's
why.
Yes, tell us why.
The reason why is because ACON has signed up SBS and ABC to the Australian Workplace Equality Index, which is a certification or an audit that makes sure that they comply to gender identity ideology. So they can't have single-sex spaces. They have to have gender identity ideology taught to all levels of their organisation. They have to spread that ideology through their platform. They become part of a multi-level marketing scheme where they will only deal with vendors and suppliers who conform to gender identity ideology, which is a bit of a rort because that means the AWEI has to be signed up by your suppliers and vendors, so really good money for ACON. And a whole bunch of issues to make it easier for people to transition and less costly, etc. So that helps the pharmaceutical industries. It's amazing, but why should a trans lobby have so much say in our organisations, particularly our public broadcasting organisations, to push this ideology, and we don't get a vote on it. We don't get a say.
Yes.
So that's the reason why they are not servicing us to give a balanced view or to have the other side ever. In fact, they can't. They get ticks. They get sort of points they score from being compliant to gender ideology, and they get onto a leaderboard. And and you can go up and get, say, platinum or gold or bronze medals, etc., for how high you get on the board. So that's what it is. A kind of a gamification system where they get virtual signalling awards and people clap that they're so virtuous and wonderful while doing things that are promoting an ideology that is extremely harmful for children, women.
Absolutely. And this is a public broadcaster. We're paying for this.
Yep.
This is not some privately owned broadcaster that's owned by gender ideologues.
Yeah.
This is owned by the Australian people.
Yeah.
And there was just recently, there was a very clear case that was brought to my attention, and I posted about it on IWD Brisbane Meanjin, and it relates to the interview with the young intersex boy Noah last weekend.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a wonderful interview, and he was arguing for there not to be surgery inflicted on intersex people, that they should be able to make up their minds when they're adults. And he said they had the interview, which is on YouTube, and he says very clearly, and he pauses before he says it, "We are not trans."
Yeah.
He says it very clearly. And yet when the ABC transcribed that interview onto its website, that sentence was deleted.
Yeah.
And that's such a blatant case of censorship in furthering an ideology. And it really broke faith with that boy.
But don't you feel that is just being, that would have to do that, conforming to the AWEI, because trans actually piggybacked off the intersex story. They used all the languaging like affirmation at birth, where actually our sex is observed. But for a small percentage, tiny percentage, who are still, most of them are male and female, by the way,
Yes.
their sex is affirmed because they have to dig in deeper because of, the certain birth disorders, etc., that make it hard to determine by just looking at them,
Yeah.
So they sort of stole that. But they also, a friend of mine was telling me about some other stories of intersex people, and you recognise that they took their story. They used the words of their stories for them. We know, as from a homosexual point of view, that they've piggybacked off homosexual issues all the time, although they throw us underneath the bus and say that we don't exist. We have, same-sex attraction doesn't exist. It's got to be same-gender attraction. But that's what I feel that they've done in this case. But that's disgusting, because it sounds like, I haven't seen it yet, another friend recommended it, but it sounds like this kid was actually making a statement.
Yes.
He was trying to have a voice, and they just cut him off.
Yes, exactly.
True?
Yes.
I must put down a link to that and watch it myself. Okay.
Mm.
So, over all this time and all your fights that you've been involved in, Anna, what are your main lessons you've learned? What are actually, one thing I suppose I'm interested in is, what are the main lessons that have shaped you as you are now?
Look, I think one of the big lessons is persistence.
Yeah.
And recognizing that no victory is going to come easily for women in particular, and that it will take a long time, and we just have to keep going, keep going, keep going. I can remember a time, and it would have been the late 80s, early 90s, when we had the election of a state Labor government. The Labor Party had policy that said they'd repeal abortion laws, and I genuinely thought, and the rest of us in that group thought, all we've got to do is keep meeting with more MPs, Labor MPs, go to this one, point their policy out to them, and eventually they'll fall into line and they'll do what they've said they'll do. And they didn't. And so the lesson for me over that 40-year campaign was to be persistent. that we have to keep going. But the other lesson I think that I've learned more recently in the fight for women's sex-based rights is that collective action is not always possible. And I've always believed very strongly in collective analysis and collective action. But for this battle, which has been the most toxic and horrendous battle I have ever been involved in my life, sometimes the collective isn't ready to come with you. And so if you're faced with the choice of collective action or going it alone, then sometimes you have to go it alone. And perhaps the collective will follow. So that they're two lessons, I think. And I guess the other one is one that you often talk about, Kat, and that is that purity politics is inappropriate, totally inappropriate at this time, because all of my natural allies are from the left and women's services and women's groups. And in Brisbane, not one of those left-wing groups or any other women's group has been prepared to stand up to defend women's sex-based rights. Not one. And so, you know, that the left, I've always seen the left as the natural ally for women's liberation, but now I don't. I don't think we have allies. Certainly the right is not an ally either. I actually don't think that we have allies at this time.
Yeah, see, I must admit, I get up everybody's nose on this topic. I tend to offend everybody on this topic because, and I suppose it's coming from a Maori perspective. You know, Maori are not a homogeneous group. You know, we're a bastard mix of people who tiki-toured over to New Zealand. They tell the story about New Zealanders as Maori coming in Seven Waka, which is a load of crap. You know, there was hundreds of us coming in and going, bonking with everybody and everything around the Pacific. So we were really different, distinct groups. But we have a tendency, because we're all traders initially, that we did at least talk to each other. And we had the bigger enemy, which was the English. We would just say, put aside our fights for a while and gang up together and just say, okay, for a short period of time, we're not fighting each other, we're just fighting that lot. And then we'll go back to fighting each other once we've knocked him off. Do you know what I mean? And we have no qualms about that. We could hate, you know, I won't tell you what the tribe is because I get angry letters from them. But there's a tribe that we despise, absolutely despise them to hell. Every time we look at them, it's like, we do not like you. You know, even now, just as a tradition, you know, but we're on their side when it was fighting against the English, and we bit them, and then we went back to fighting each other again, as you do. So I don't understand why we can't do this, because, you know, sometimes there's the Catholics. I mean, in Maori culture, if you've got a nasty big dog, which is a pharmaceutical industry that's backing this, and the men's rights movement, which is backing this, they're the ugly, mean dog. Why don't you put another ugly dog against them, like the Catholics? Let them have at it, you know? To me, I don't understand, you know. And there are right-wing people who are supportive of things for certain reasons, like they want single-sex spaces. So why not step over on that issue? But then I have a big issue anyway around the whole idea of classes and categories and things like that. I just have a completely different perspective on that, which is one of the reasons why I'll never be a feminist or any kind of ist. It's
right,
it's not the way I see the world. I've got a different framework.
And that's probably a whole other conversation, and I'm aware of the time. So if just to finish, if I could encourage people to come to International Women's Day next year in Brisbane, Meanjin, the weekend of the 5th and 6th of March, we will hold a radical feminist conference. It will be small, it won't be well funded, but it will happen. Please
now, have
come.
you got some links for that? Have you got any links?
No, not yet. No,
okay.
Not yet.
If you need a hand, I can
just diarise. Okay. Diarise 5 and 6 of March.
Okay, I'll put that in the links below.
Okay.
On the Facebook for Meanjin.
Well, you could put a link to the IWD Brisbane Meanjin Facebook page.
I'll do that. Any other link?
No, that's all. Oh, well, yes. I think the Coalition for Biological Reality, because it's really the national it's the national coming together of a whole lot of gender critical and radical feminist pages, but not all radical feminist. It has a national voice. And also a global link would be the Women's Human Rights Campaign.
Yes, absolutely.
Which has been going for a little while now, probably coming up to 2 or 3 years in next March. We've got 20,000 signatures supporting the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. The Women's Human Rights Campaign conducts a webinar every week. Unfortunately, it's at 1 a.m. our time, but they're all put on YouTube at a later date, and they're fabulous because there are speakers, feminist speakers from all corners of the globe. But also they conduct a radical feminist webinar on Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And they decided to make it that time so that women in our region could attend. And it's great. It's just 1 hour, 7 o'clock. You sit there with your glass of wine.
But it's only once a month, isn't it?
No, it's every week.
Oh,
But the other thing is the monthly webinar, which is run by the Women's Human Rights Campaign Australia and New Zealand chapter. And that's a monthly event on Saturday night.
Okay, well,
and it is advertised on the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights Facebook page. So if anyone hasn't signed the declaration yet, please sign it, please share it. We've got 20,000 people and climbing.
Amazing. You were awesome, Anna.
You too, Kat. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you. Bye.
See you.